Hi everyone, Gabe here with B&H, and in today's video, it is my pleasure and privilege to present to you the 2022 reissue of the Minimoog Model D monophonic analog synthesizer. Let's hear it. If you have listened to music anywhere between 1970 and today, chances are that you've heard the sound of a synthesizer so unique and iconic that it revolutionized music and how it is made and played. That synth is the Minimoog Model D by Moog. Since its initial release in 1970, the Model D has been used by artists of international renown such as Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, Sun Ra, James Brown, Stevie Wonder, Pink Floyd, Dr. Dre, Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson, to name only a few. The 2022 reissue brings back the original circuitry, design and legendary sound of the original Model D, as well as a few upgrades based on popular modifications of the original units, like the overload circuit, a dedicated LFO, a spring-loaded pitch wheel, and an expanded patch bay. And wow, there is really nothing like the real thing. This Model D reissue sounds amazing and ranges from subtle to positively massive. It is intuitive, captivating, and just a lot of fun to use. First off, this new edition of the Model D is housed in a beautiful, locally sourced Appalachian cherry dark wood. It looks absolutely gorgeous, and it transpires craftsmanship and attention to detail. The top panel replicates the iconic design and layout of the original Model D, with the controllers panel all the way to the left, and the oscillator bank directly next to it with oscillator 1, 2, and 3, the mixer in the middle, and to the right the filter and filter envelope controls, as well as the modifiers and the output section all the way to the right. In the central mixer section live the 3 oscillators, on and off switches, and level control knobs, as well as the noise generator with its volume control knob and a white and pink noise toggle. Also in this section is the overload circuit with a volume control and overload light, but more about that a little later. The tuning knob in the controller section sets the general tuning of the Model D, but for the sake of this demo, we'll keep it at 0. In the mixer section, let's turn on oscillator 1 and set its volume all the way up to 10. Now when I press a key, you'll hear the waveform generated by oscillator 1. Each oscillator has a range knob that goes from low all the way up to 2 and sets the oscillator's octave. And each oscillator can generate 6 different waveforms. The only difference between oscillator 1 and 2 and oscillator 3 is that oscillator 1 and 2 can produce a triangle sawtooth hybrid and oscillator 3 a reverse sawtooth. Now let's go back to the mixer section and turn on oscillator 2. Right now, it's in perfect unison with oscillator 1, but I can either switch the range Or I can slightly detune it to generate oscillator beating and make the sound richer and bigger. And we can do the same thing with oscillator free. Now we have a really fat and rich sound. Now you can also use your detune knob to create an interval like a third or a fifth, and using oscillator free, you can even create free note chords, but we'll get back to that a little later. On the original Model D, oscillator free could be used both as a sound generator, but also as a low frequency oscillator. And you can still use it that way on the 2022 reissue. To use it as an LFO, just turn on oscillator modulation, turn off oscillator free control, and select the low range. Now you can just use the mod wheel to dial in some modulation. The detune knob now controls the LFO rate. And you can toggle between different LFO shapes with the waveform selector. Back in the mixer section, you'll find the Model D's noise generator. You can turn it on and off using the switch, and the noise can either be blended to the oscillator signal to give the sound texture, or use it in conjunction with the filter to generate effects like risers and percussive sounds. The noise generator can also be used as a modulation source, which is the perfect segue to the controllers section. To the left of the Model D lives the controllers area. The Model D provides 4 modulation sources: the dedicated LFO, the noise generator, oscillator free, and for the first time with this reissue, the filter envelope generator, which is an ideal modulation source for creating analog brass and percussive sound. To modulate your signal, make sure to toggle the oscillator modulation switch on, and then select the modulation source you want to use with the switches at the bottom of the panel. For example, I'm going to use the filter envelope generator and the noise generator as modulation sources, and dial in a little bit of modulation using the mod wheel. If the mix knob is panned hard left, only the filter envelope generator modulation affects the signal. If I pan it hard right, you can only hear the noise modulation. And if the knob is centered, you can hear a 50-50 blend of each modulation source. And the more you push the mod wheel up, the more the modulation will be potent. Following that same principle, using, let's say, the dedicated LFO as a modulation source, you can modulate, for example, the pitch ever so slightly and create a super funky vibrato effect that is a favorite of funk keyboardists. On the left of the modulation mix knob, you'll find the glide knob that adjusts the length of the transition between 2 notes. But for the glide to work, you'll have to switch it on in the left-hand keyboard panel first. Once that's done, you can adjust the glide length from 0, where there's no transition, to 100. Now let's go back down to the left-hand keyboard panel. This is where one of the major upgrades of this 2022 reissue lives. Behold, the spring-loaded pitch wheel. The pitch wheel lets you bend the notes up or down. It used to be that you had to reset the pitch wheel back to neutral position and hope for the best. But these days are behind us, and the new and improved spring-loaded pitch wheel resets to neutral position on its own. Just next to it is the mod wheel, which, as we just discussed, lets you dial in the amount of modulation desired, and above, a decay switch, which activates the decay in the loudness control panel. The left-hand keyboard panel is also where the dedicated LFO lives. The knob is push and pull, and you can choose a square shape by pulling it and a triangle shape when it's pushed in, and set the LFO rate by dialing it. And remember that super funky vibrato effect I mentioned earlier? Well, here it is, generated by the dedicated LFO and the mod wheel. Okay, now let's move to the right side of the top panel. Here you'll find the modifiers, aka the filter and the loudness control controls. Let's start with the filter, since it's one of the critical components that gives the Model D its thick, punchy sound. The Model D is equipped with a traditional Moog ladder filter with a 10 Hz to 32 kHz frequency response. So when a note is played, the harmonic content above the filter cutoff frequency is reduced, while frequencies below the cutoff frequency pass freely. Next to it, you'll find the emphasis knob, often referred to as the resonance control, which takes a portion of the filter's output and sends it back to the input of the filter, which can result in the filter self-oscillating. But instead of talking about it, let's let the Moog ladder filter speak for itself. Simply amazing. You can use the filter manually, like I was just doing, or you can automate the filter cutoff frequency using the filter envelope generator, just below the filter frequency controls. Bringing the attack up will open the filter over time, the decay will close it, and the sustain will set the filter cutoff frequency if a note is held. And just below that row of knobs, you'll find the classic loudness control controls to shape your sound. Just remember, you must activate decay in the left-hand keyboard control panel for it to kick in. Let's get back to the mixer panel quickly. It was popular with the original Model D to feed the headphone output back into the unit's external audio processing input to generate an overdrive effect and give the original signal more edge. With this new version, the Model D will scale the output signal and feed it back to itself internally, eliminating the need for patch cables, at least for this use. When activated, the overload light turns on to signal the audio overload. And of course, you can also still process external audio, for instance, the signal of a guitar or another synth, through your Model D by using the top panel external input. Last and all the way to the right of the top panel is the output section. It's pretty straightforward. You'll find a main output on and off switch, as well as a master volume knob, and a 1/4-inch headphone jack output with volume control. There is also an A440 tone generator to tune the Minimoog Model D if required. Last but not least, let's talk about the keyboard of the 2022 reissue and its extended features. This Model D is equipped with a 44 keys TP9 Fatar keyboard that can generate a velocity control voltage and an Aftertouch control voltage, making the Model D super expressive. You'll just need a couple of 1/4-inch TRS cables to set things up in the top patch panel. There, you'll find 5 pins, MIDI in, through, and out ports, the after pressure, pitch, V-trig, and velocity out control outputs, as well as the loudness, filter, oscillator, modulation source, and external V-trig control inputs. So for instance, you can patch the velocity out to the loudness in control inputs, and your Model D will now be velocity sensitive. Or if you patch the Aftertouch out to the filter in, you'll be able to control the filter cutoff frequency using the Aftertouch. There's a lot that can be done with that top patch panel, so make sure you explore all the possibilities when your Model D gets here. Now, even though the Minimoog is a mono synth, well, free oscillators mean free notes. So with a little time and ingenuity, you can easily create any free note chords you want. For example, I can create a major chord, a minor chord, but I can also express more complex chords, like a 7th chord. It requires a bit of mental gymnastics, but it is worth it. When creating saw pads, another trick is to detune the Model D slightly and re-record the pads to create a super saw effects and beef up your sound, like such. Another thing you should think of when using an analog synth is using effects to sculpt the sound even further. Let's take this sound for instance. It's nothing special, but add a little reverb and a bit of delay, and now it sounds rich, lush, and a lot more interesting. Same thing for this bass sound. It sounds pretty good, but check out what happens with a bit of digital distortion added to it. So as you can see, effects can bring your synth sounds to the next level. Right now, I'm using stock effects from my DAW, but you can use your favorite plugins or effects pedal, whatever floats your boat. Some would say that part of the downside of analog synths is that you cannot save presets. But I would argue that it's part of the beauty and pleasure we take in using them. That being said, if you create a sound you really love, there is no shame in keeping the setting on a patch sheet to jog your memory the next time you want to use it. These low-tech presets can come in really handy if you need to recreate a sound. But with time and experience, it will just come naturally. And with this, we come to the end of this presentation of the 2022 reissue of the Minimoog Model D by Moog. And just wow! It is not every day that I have such an icon on my bench. I mean, this analog synth is truly music royalty. And it was so well designed and ahead of its time in 1970 that more than 50 years later it sounds as modern and relevant as ever. The Minimoog Model D is an inspiration Kickstarter, and after exploring with it for a few days I feel I've barely scratched the surface. And as someone who's used virtual emulation of this synth, I can tell you that there is truly nothing like the real thing, and I could make music with it for hours on end. So how do you think the Minimoog Model D sounds, and what are your thoughts on the improvements made from the previous models? Let us know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the music. This was Gabe with B&H, and I'll see you next time.